Hello, my name's Sylvia Bishop and I'm going to be reading today from my new book, 44 Tiny Secrets, illustrated by the fabulous Ashley King. I'm going to be reading from chapter 3, so there's a few things you need to know. Firstly, our hero Betsy. She comes from a family of pianists. So her mother, her father and her grandfather are all famous, fabulous pianists. She has overheard her mother saying how disappointed she is that Betsy doesn't seem to follow in their footsteps. She's not especially good at the piano. And she has decided she wants to show her parents that she can do better. So while they've been away, she's spent all week practicing every day with her granddad and planning to surprise them. The night they get back, they're holding a very swanky party. Anyone from London is planning to come, so that's where Betsy wants to play for them. She's just finished, and we don't know whether it's gone well or badly at the end of the last chapter. So that's what we're about to find out. I think the only other thing you need to know is that the house is full of ferns. Her mother has an obsession with potted ferns. Oh, and that one of the women at the party is called Vera Brick, and we do not like her. Okay, this is chapter 3, A Terrible Tragedy. Betsy was confused. She thought she'd been note perfect. Well, maybe there had been an odd wrong note here and there, but no kersplunks. When she took her hands off the piano keys, she had been overjoyed. People had clapped. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Grandad's elbows pumping out applause like bellows. But as she looked around, she realised, with a sinking horror, that all the smiles were either fake or smug, that all the applause was just a polite patter, and that the whispering was beginning, vigorous and vicious. She looked at her parents. They were applauding hard, too hard, as though they thought they could clap the pattering applause up into a storm by themselves. But their smiles were forced, and they weren't meeting anybody's eyes. Betsy wasn't fooled. "Oh my, what an embarrassment," whispered Vera very loudly. Betsy's face burned. It somehow made it worse that she didn't know what she'd done wrong. She wanted to run out of the room and hide. But even if Betsy Bow-Linnet was a disappointment and a mess and an embarrassment, she was quite determined not to be a coward. So she squiggled a tiny bow, sort of smiled, and walked as calmly as she could back to Grandad. A moment later, someone was squealing, "Me! Me!" champagne glass aloft, and the whole thing was over. Just like that. "Did I do something wrong, Grandad?" Betsy whispered. Grandad shook his head vigorously. "You were note perfect." "Then why did Vera say I was an embarrassment?" Grandad wafted his elbows in an enormous shrug. "Vera Brick," he said, "is a mystery to me." And after a moment's thought, he added, "And long may she remain so." Betsy couldn't get anything but compliments out of Grandad, and she wanted the truth. She would have to ask her parents. But every time she looked for them, she found them caught in a different web of friends, and she couldn't get them alone. She tried not to believe they were doing it on purpose. In the end, she gave in and did her best to look like a fern and wait for the whole thing to be over. She wasn't as good at it as Grandad was. She was too wriggly to be very good at blending in. People kept noticing her and saying things like, "Good effort, dear," and "That was very brave of you," which were not real compliments. It seemed to be hours and hours before everyone finally began to trickle into the hall one by one, repeat all the hugging and handshaking, take their coats and take their leave. When the last guest had finally gone, saying, "You looked very pretty at the piano, Poppet," on her way out, Betsy hugged her mother for a long time. "What did I do wrong, Mum?" "Oh, darling," said her mother, curling round her sadly. "Nothing. Nothing at all. People just had silly expectations." "What expectations?" But Bella said that the ferns were giving her hay fever and went upstairs to bed. Betsy looked at her father. "Dad? I want to know what I did. Why was everyone whispering about me?" Bertram looked as though he was going to tell her it was nothing too, but she did her fiercest face. So he sighed, bent down, and put his hands on her shoulders. "All right, Bee, you deserve to know what they were saying, but you must remember their silly opinions don't matter, even a little bit. You know that, yes?" Betsy nodded. Bertram paused, searching for the right words, before he said, "You were note perfect, but there's more to playing than getting the notes right. There's the passion, the rises and falls, the sense of the music." He said this last part a bit wearily, as if he sometimes wished there wasn't quite so much passion. "And I didn't have that?" "No, Bee," he said, not unkindly, "but it doesn't matter, you know, it really doesn't. You mustn't worry about it for a second." And he gave her an earnest sort of hug. "Vera Brick said I was an embarrassment." She was wrong. Mum doesn't get hay fever. Bertram opened his mouth, changed his mind, shut it again, and opened it in a new shape. "Well, your mother is very tired from the trip." There was a long silence. Sometimes Bertram had trouble thinking of the right thing to say, so Betsy gave up waiting for any further explanation, hugged him good night, and went upstairs to bed. From his study across the landing, Grandad came out with cheerful elbows and more compliments. Betsy said a hasty good night and hid herself in her room. She didn't sleep for a long time. The next day, her parents pretended very hard that nothing bad had happened. Bella took her out for milkshakes, and on the way back they stopped at Betsy's favourite pet shop to look at all the animals, and Bella let her spend ages and ages saying hello to every last hamster and rabbit and stick insect. She was being so kind and trying so hard to take Betsy's mind off things that it was difficult to believe Betsy really did disappoint her. If only, Betsy thought, she hadn't overheard that one small sentence. By the evening, she had half decided to just put up with being a disappointment. She snuck out of bed when she was meant to be asleep and dangled her legs through the banisters to take a reassuring look at her world below. The heads of her mum and dad and granddad still crisscrossed along the hall, and the ferns still swayed, and the black and white spirals on the marble floor still looked like they were swirling if you squinted at them a bit funny. Nothing had really changed. She could just forget. She watched the parlour light go out, and then the light in Grandad's study opposite, and finally she went back to bed. And perhaps that would have been the end of it all if it hadn't been for the next day's edition of the London Natter. It was Vera Brick who brought a copy over. Bertram, Bella, Betsy and Grandad had just finished lunch and were rounding it off with tea and cake when she stopped by, just for the smallest of seconds, and unfurled the paper on the table with a flourish. She said she thought they ought to know. "I mean," she exhaled, woe-struck, and she clasped her hands to her bosom to show just how much she meant it, but what exactly she meant was still a mystery. Bertram pulled the paper closer, looked it over his spectacles, and read the page's title out loud. "At 50 hats, you might not realise are hats that you can buy for less than a yacht." "No, no," said Vera, sounding just a smidge less woe-struck and the tiniest bit impatient. "Not that. The gossip column." The London Natter's gossip column was the most colossal waste of paper ever invented. It commented on the rich and famous in London, what they had been wearing, who they had been dating, what colour they'd painted their front doors, how they took their tea. Bertram looked at it uncertainly, coughed, and obediently began to read about Celia Botherdown's weekend in Scarborough. "This," announced Grandad, "is extremely tedious." "Keep going, Bertie," urged Vera. So Bertram read about the birthday party of the youngest child of Clara and Clarence Howlaverley. Little Miss Howlaverley had worn a dress made of sequins sewn together by specially trained spiders using their own thread. "Really, Vera," said Bella delicately, "where is this—" "Shh!" said Vera, almost rudely. Bertram rolled on as if nobody had interrupted. "While one child sparkled this weekend, another certainly did not." He hesitated then and looked at Betsy. "Read it, Dad," said Betsy quietly. He dithered, then hesitated some more. "I'd rather hear it from you," said Betsy, "than read it myself later." "Well," said Bertram uncertainly, "it's a lot of rubbish, Bee." And then, very quickly and quietly, he read out, "Betsy Bow-Linnet, only daughter of noted concert pianists Bella and Bertram Bow-Linnet, stunned partygoers this Saturday with an entirely lifeless performance of Chopin's Mazurka in B-flat. It was completely robotistical, one guest confided to the Natter. She hasn't got a drop of talent. Such a tragedy. Our source adds that Betsy spent most of the night doing a very substandard impression of a fern." There were hot tears in Betsy's eyes, but she blinked them away. She was determined not to give Vera the satisfaction. Bertram put the paper down and looked at them all. He frowned. He pushed his glasses up his nose. He cleared his throat. He said, "Is robotistical a word?" Vera thought that was beside the point, and for once Betsy was inclined to agree with her. "It is exactly the point," said Grandad, red in the face with annoyance. "The point being that this was written by an idiot, and it will be read by idiots, in one never-ending loop of astonishing idiocy." "Oh, so true," agreed Vera, nodding vigorously, as if she herself never read the Natter. "I certainly wouldn't give it a moment's thought. I just thought Betsy should hear it from a friend," she added, looking compassionately at a patch of wall a little to the left of Betsy. "Thank you, Vera, that's very thoughtful of you," said Bella. "Now, Betsy, darling, you're not to worry about it." And she put her lips into a smile. It looked like she was trying not to cry. "Let's all talk about something nicer." Vera's mission of mercy was over, but she carried on woozing around tragically until they offered her some tea and cake, and that cheered her up sharpish. She still didn't show any sign of leaving, so Betsy asked to be excused and got up from the table. As she left, they all told her not to worry about the column. She nodded and promised that she wouldn't, but of course she did. It's difficult not to worry about being a disappointment and a mess and an embarrassment and a tragedy. She worried about it all evening, and that night she stayed up so late worrying about it that she didn't wake up until very late the next day. Her parents had left her a note explaining that they had gone to have coffee and cake with someone or other, and Grandad was outside gardening. The garden and the shed were Grandad's territory, and he grew anything and everything there, apart from ferns. When Betsy went downstairs, the huge house seemed very quiet and lonely. She felt like she didn't belong there anymore, as if even the house knew she wasn't a real pianist. She pattered across the hall, heading towards the parlour, then stopped, surprised. There was a letter for her on the doormat. It had no stamp and no address, just her name, written in the blackest ink on a stiff cream envelope. "Huh," said Betsy. "That's strange." This, she would soon learn, was a staggering understatement.